Well, can I welcome you to the inaugural Speaker's Lecture. My name's David Elder and I'm the Clerk of the House of Representatives, and we're very pleased to see so many of you here for a lecture that will talk about really the last 30 years. I mean, this is an appropriate and a very good time to reflect on the history of the House and the experience of the House in this building on this, the 30th anniversary open day of Parliament House. But can I commence by acknowledging and showing my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be present. So welcome very much to this lecture. Just a couple of the usual housekeeping things, like me, just hopefully you've just double-checked your mobile phone to make sure it's switched to silent or is switched off so that we don't have any interruptions. And also to mention that Paul will probably speak for about 30 minutes and then he's very happy to take questions, and we hope to conclude no later than 3:30, so that just gives you a bit of a guide to the proceedings. But can I commence by introducing the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honourable Tony Smith MP. As you mentioned, it is the Speaker's inaugural lecture, so the most appropriate person to introduce Paul to us, of course, is the Speaker himself. So over to you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you very much, David. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Open Day at Australian Parliament House on the 30th anniversary of the opening of the building. We are spoilt today to have Paul Kelly with us to give this inaugural lecture. He is very well known to so many of you as the editor-at-large at The Australian, and anyone following politics, parliament or public affairs knows that Paul is required reading. And we're particularly appreciative that you've taken time to come here today, Paul. You have a very busy life writing for The Australian and of course on television as well. But the reason we decided upon Paul was because everything that's happened in this building since its opening in 1988, Paul has covered, not just in his newspaper columns, but in his series of books that he's written about all of the events in this building and in Australian public life. Indeed, Paul worked, of course, at Old Parliament House, and at the time this building opened, he was president of the Press Gallery. So literally every day of the happenings in this building, Paul has been witness to one way or another, and it's very fitting that he's here today to reflect on the last 30 years, to look forward, to look at some of the challenges. And the title of his address is The Parliament in its New Home, the House of Representatives in Action, 1988 to 2018. Would you give Paul a very warm welcome?
Speaker of the House, Tony Smith, Clerk of the House, David Elder, it's a great pleasure for me to deliver this lecture today. It took 87 years after Federation to establish Australia's first permanent Parliament House. It was opened by Queen Elizabeth on the 9th of May 1988. I was here and I vividly remember the day. Prime Minister Bob Hawke reminded that this region has seen an Aboriginal presence for at least 21,000 years. This building was the third home to the Commonwealth Parliament. For the first 26 years, it lived in borrowed splendour in Melbourne's State Parliament House building. And then for the next 61 years, it lived in what we now fondly called Old Parliament House. At a time when democracy is under challenge around the world, it is salutary to recall Hawke's warning 30 years ago not to take the survival of democracy for granted. He said MPs had an obligation upon them to recognise always in the conduct of debate that whatever their views, their ideology, their party, they are part of something bigger, an institution which must endure long after the divisive issues of the day have been fought and resolved. Each generation of parliamentarians should be judged according to Hawke's dictum at the opening. The departure from the overcrowded, much-loved and Machiavellian intimacy of old Parliament House was bathed in nostalgia. On the last night, politicians, staff and journalists joined hands to sing Old Lang Syne. They partied in the chamber and on the benches. In his farewell speech in the old building, Hawke said, "This chamber is the most historic room in Australia," a statement that remains true of the current House of Representatives chamber in this building, where history, perhaps too much history, is still being made. The new building cost $1.1 billion. It houses a tapestry in the Great Hall based on Arthur Boyd's painting of a bush landscape. It holds 5,000 people when the Parliament is in session and receives an average of 1 million visitors each year. The House of Representatives met in this building for the first time at 4 p.m. on Monday, the 22nd of August, 1988. The Speaker was Joan Child. The Governor-General, Sir Ninian Stephen. Hawke was still Prime Minister. John Howard was Leader of the Opposition. And Ian Sinclair was Leader of the National Party. For the Prime Minister, every lever of power in this building is within reach. Cabinet, ministers, advisors, media. The Cabinet room was located across the corridor from the Prime Minister's office. Ministerial officers were just walking distance away. The Prime Minister and ministers enjoyed expansive offices that they filled with many personal advisors. And in a gift for media management, the Prime Minister and ministers would enjoy proximity to the press gallery, located on the second level, once 300 strong with journalists and the most influential media hub for communications with the people. The building was a monument to the centralisation of executive power. The building, however, was the home of the Parliament, with its capacity to make and break governments. Under Australia's system of responsible government, the people do not elect the Prime Minister. Our system is not government by the people. It was never government by the people. Australia is a representative democracy. The people elect the Parliament, and the Parliament decides who governs. In practice, which party has the majority on the floor of the House of Representatives. In the life of its 30 years, the new building has seen 8 Prime Ministers, but only 3 changes of government. The nation has undergone a conspicuous transition from an era of stability to an era of instability. This period has seen the completion of the 2 longest-serving Prime Ministerships after Menzies. The 9-year Hawke Prime Ministership, the longest for the Labor Party and the 3rd longest since Federation, and the 11-year Howard Prime Ministership, the 2nd longest since Federation. Yet these anchors of stability are contrasted with another story over the past decade, an extraordinary instability since John Howard's 2007 departure. In each of the last 4 parliaments, the Prime Minister has been deposed by party room revolts. Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull were removed by their own parties. Indeed, no Prime Minister has completed a full 3-year parliamentary term since Howard in 2007, a remarkable situation. In the past 11 years, on only 2 occasions have Prime Ministers been removed by the people at elections. Howard in 2007, when he lost to Rudd, and Rudd in 2013, when he lost to Abbott. This instability has occurred under both Labor and coalition governments. Each revolt had its own rationale, but there are, I believe, common elements. First, the influence of public opinion polls, which can be as dangerous to Prime Ministers as elections. Second, MPs are prepared to resort to a change of Prime Minister as a mere tactic when fearing an election defeat. And third, our political culture seems more impatient, with both the public and MPs more prepared to make a quicker, adverse judgment against leaders. For a Prime Minister, opposition leader or minister, parliamentary performance is a vital aspect of the craft. Yet communication with the public does occur largely outside the chamber. In my view, the two most effective Prime Ministers in the new chamber have been Paul Keating and John Howard, despite their contrasting styles. Both had a feel for the chamber, and they knew that authority in Parliament mattered for a Prime Minister because of that critical and immediate audience, the MPs sitting behind them. Old Parliament House, with its late sitting hours, was very much a place of nocturnal activity. New Parliament House, with its timber floors and vast windows, is a place of daytime activity. The new building highlights and promotes a change of lifestyle of politicians, staff and media who work here. One symbolic transition was an event once inconceivable, the 1996 closure of the non-members bar, the space eventually being occupied by a childcare centre. Now, the non-members bar in Old Parliament House was popular and became one of the great broking houses of our politics. For a journalist during the Whitlam era of the early 1970s, a visit to the bar about 7 p.m. on a sitting night was a compulsory event, where it functioned as a huge information exchange. The tempo of parliamentary life changed in the new building. The day starts earlier. It is more intense. Sitting hours are not as protracted into the night, and people are more health conscious. When the childcare centre opened in 2009, Labor's Anthony Albanese welcomed it with these words: "The fact we have many facilities in this building, a snooker room, a pool, a gym, a dining room, and many other facilities here that are appropriate to this magnificent building, but no childcare centre, reflects the Parliament of the last century." And so the Parliament was being updated for a new century. While radio broadcasts of Parliament have been a feature of our national life since 1946, on 31 March 1991, Question Time in the House of Representatives was televised for the first time. The coming of television coverage was essential and inevitable. Yet there have been mixed assessments ever since about the impact of television on debate in the Parliament. When veteran MP Ian Sinclair was elected Speaker in 1998, he reflected upon these transitions from the old to the new building, saying, "It would be my hope we can bring to this chamber some of the magic that existed for so long down there. It was a place where personal debate and policy debate, I think, was of a far higher order than regrettably is often achieved in this place." Few, I think, would say that Sinclair's hopes were realised. As current Speaker Tony Smith said in his 2018 Alfred Deakin lecture, question time in Parliament these days is highly choreographed. Television has led to a far more scripted, party-managed, less spontaneous question period, where the aim of party tacticians is repetition of their main, usually populist message. Smith said, while people can now see and hear what they once only read, at another level, less and less is actually being seen and heard. In assessing the House of Representatives, however, many critiques misunderstand its nature. The House is a chamber dominated by party and structured for political combat. The adversary nature of the House will not be changed. It has defined the chamber since 1901. Smith's reminder that the chamber is neither a classroom nor a church is pertinent. Efforts to pretend it can be converted into a consensual weekend summit are doomed. In truth, away from the TV cameras, there is a much more effective scrutiny of bills in the chamber and committees. The last 30 years, however, have seen a parliament with the capacity to grow and adapt and meet the demands of a changing nation. Its evolution is impressive, along with its expanding purposes as a national forum. In December 1993, Keating as Prime Minister presided over a milestone, the passage of the Native Title Act following the High Court's Mabo decision that overturned the doctrine of terra nullius on which British settlement of Australia was based. This decision altered power relations between black and white. It put an onus on the Parliament to legislate a system of native title, and the Parliament responded in a divided yet constructive way. The bill was passed after the longest debate in the Senate's history. One of the most moving days in the new building was the 13th of February 2008. This was the apology to the Indigenous Australians, especially to members of the stolen generations, offered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. With many Indigenous members of these generations in attendance, Rudd said it was unfinished business to remove a great stain from the nation's soul. He delivered the apology for the hurt, the pain, and the suffering. The coalition in opposition supported the apology, sealing the bipartisanship. The task of economic reform has been a permanent challenge to the Parliament. Its most significant manifestation in this building came in 1999, after the Howard government's 1998 re-election on a tax reform package. The reform involved a 10% GST, replacing a decrepit indirect tax system with proceeds going to the states, and reforms to personal income tax and family tax payments. Howard and Peter Costello managed to prevail, but just. This event, in retrospect, looms as a turning point. It was the last occasion when the government and Parliament authorised a big-picture taxation reform. It can be seen, therefore, as the last chapter of ambitious tax reform for the country during the past generation. The lesson of the 1998 election and the Parliament's response is that support for economic reform was on the wane. The 1998 election was fought overwhelmingly on the GST tax package. Yet within hours of being defeated, the Labor Party denied that John Howard had any mandate for tax reform. The nation sank into a negative public debate. With the future of the government in doubt, if unable to legislate the package, Howard secured a compromise deal with Australian Democrat leader Meg Lees that saw the passage of the reform, but that deal did contribute to the eventual demise of the Democrats as a party. By contrast, climate change and energy has been the most divisive, convulsive, and protracted area of policy conflict seen in this building. For a decade, the parties have contested this space without reaching any agreement. The political system has not been able to reconcile Australia's desire for emissions reductions on the one hand with its resistance towards higher power prices on the other. Few issues in our history have contributed to the removal of so many political leaders. Witness Turnbull in 2009, Rudd in 2010, Gillard in 2013, and Turnbull again in 2018. Rudd won the 2007 election, elevating climate change as a moral challenge, the policy upshot being the 2011 Clean Energy Bill and related laws passed under the Gillard government for an ambitious emissions trading scheme, often branded a carbon tax. Abbott won the 2013 election pledging its abolition, and the policy was repealed in 2014. Yet the coalition's divisions on energy policy resurfaced under Turnbull and played a part in his 2018 loss of the Prime Ministership. Heading into the next election, the Coalition and Labor remain deeply divided over energy and climate change policy. The two most significant social reforms of the past decade reveal the Parliament responding to fundamental changing social values. In 2013, under the Gillard government, the National Disability Insurance Bill was passed, with Julia Gillard saying, "The scheme to be established by this bill will transform the lives of people with disability, their families and carers." There has been bipartisan support for the NDIS. In 2017, the Parliament, under the Turnbull government, legislated for same-sex marriage. This followed a postal plebiscite where nearly 80% of eligible people voted, with the yes vote prevailing 62% to 38%. On 7 December, the private member's bill of Liberal Senator Dean Smith, co-sponsored by a range of senators, passed the House, having earlier been passed by the Senate. After several years of dispute, same-sex marriage became the law of the land, with only 4 members in the House voting against. The recent period has seen 2 of the closest elections in history, both with implications for the House of Representatives. The 2010 election produced the first hung parliament since 1940. Julia Gillard negotiated with 3 independents and the Australian Greens to form a minority government, and Labor was able to serve a full 3-year term. There are 2 judgments on this period. First, in legislative terms, it was successful, and Gillard enjoyed a high success rate of 96% for the passage of her bills. Second, the deals and compromises involved in minority government undermined Gillard in political terms, and her political advisor John McTiernan said, "All of the flack of minority government was sucked into her prime ministership because she was so central to the deals." The July 2016 election, called by Malcolm Turnbull, was the first double dissolution election since 1987. It was the first to be advised from the new building and only the 7th since Federation. The deadlock bills concerned industrial relations. While the Turnbull government was narrowly elected with 76 seats and a majority of 1, there were 5 seats won by minor parties and independent candidates. This established a beachhead in the House. Trends suggest it might only grow. But this development was even more dramatic in the Senate, where the post-election crossbench constituted 20 out of 76 senators, more than a quarter of the chamber, the largest crossbench since Federation. The inability of governments to control the Senate had been firmly established since the 1980 election, when the Fraser government lost its Senate majority. Since then, no government in the House of Representatives has controlled the Senate, with one exception, the Howard government in its final 2004 to 2007 term. The 2016 election testified to the declining vote of the major parties, Coalition and Labor. In the House, they polled a total of only 77% of the vote, and in the Senate, only 65% of the vote, less than two-thirds. The trend suggests an entrenched protest vote against the major parties in favour of minor parties and independents, and the institutionalisation of a Senate crossbench made up of minor parties and independents. In the current Parliament in the Senate, the Greens are to the left of the Labor Party, and Pauline Hanson's One Nation is to the right of the coalition. The lived experience is that a larger crossbench with widely different outlooks makes the passage of legislation more difficult. The post-2013 period of coalition government has seen a substantial degree of conflict between the House and the Senate. Indeed, this has been the most extensive since the Whitlam government in its 1972 to 1975 experience. Much of this conflict centred around the Abbott government's first 2014-15 budget, when a number of politically contentious measures failed to secure Senate approval. In 2018, the government abandoned one of its main policies from the 2016 election campaign, corporate tax cuts for companies with a turnover of more than $50 million annually, because of its inability to secure Senate support. While the pattern of Australian politics for nearly 40 years has been a government controlling the House and in a minority in the Senate, the experience since 2013 suggests a far greater difficulty in making this arrangement work successfully. Recognising such difficulty, the President of the Senate, Scott Ryan, in his August 2018 Alfred Deakin lecture, suggested the role of the Senate had changed. He said, "For as long as the Senate is a forum for the expression of demands that make compromise more difficult, our legislative process will not function as it needs to. Governments need to be able to legislate the agenda they take to elections. Otherwise, we will see frustration at democracy increase." It is a highly pertinent warning. In 2018, Australia had in Quentin Bryce its first woman appointed as Governor-General. And in 2010, Julia Gillard became the first female Prime Minister to sit in the House. Over the past 30 years, the Parliament has seen a distinct increase in the number of women representatives, yet the rate of progress has not matched expectations. At the 2016 double dissolution, the number of women elected to Parliament rose to 73 out of 226 members and senators, or 32%. The difference between the coalition parties and Labor was conspicuous. In the House, there were only 13 coalition women out of 76 members, a number most coalition MPs would regard as inadequate. On the Labor side, there were 28 female MPs out of 69 MPs in total. In 2010, the first Indigenous MP of the House of Representatives, Ken White, from the Liberal Party, was elected, later to become the first Indigenous Minister. The first Indigenous Senator was Neville Bonner, who served from 1971 to 1983 in the old building. In 2013, Nova Peris, representing the Labor Party, became the first Aboriginal woman to be elected to the Senate. When the Parliament moved to the new building, there were no Indigenous MPs, while in 2018 there are 4 Indigenous MPs. Linda Burney from the Labor Party is the first Indigenous woman to sit in the House of Representatives. In the 30 years of the new building, 8 constitutional referendum questions have been put to the people by the government and the Parliament, and 8 have been defeated. The most well-known being the 1999 referendum to convert Australia from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. The public has a distaste for constitutional change, reflecting a suspicion of the political class and, most notably, any proposal that hints giving more power to politicians. The new building is an ambitious home to the Parliament, operationally effective, lacking the intimacy of the old building, yet possessing a touch of grandeur. Its character is still evolving and is shaped by different and sometimes competing forces: political leaders, parties, MPs, public opinion, technology, and democratic faiths. Like all parliaments, it has good days, bad days, and sometimes magnificent days. In its new home, the House of Representatives has served the nation in its law-making, robust debates and commemorations. Over 30 years, it has reflected a changing nation and enshrined new and enduring laws for the people. Yet the degree of polarised party conflict, an essential aspect of our competitive democracy, has reached a counterproductive stage. The House should reflect upon the last decade and renew its commitment to an improved performance. Despite this, the House of Representatives in this building stands as one of the most effective and resilient lower houses in the democratic world. Nobody should underestimate the depth of Australia's institutional commitment to democratic accountability through this chamber. Its foundations, like those of the building, are sunk deep into Australia's soil. Thank you.
Now, as was mentioned, Paul is very happy to take questions, and I think I'd be very surprised if there's not questions. I think Paul's given us enough provocative material to keep us going for quite a while, but in fact we only have about 20 minutes. But who'd like to lead off with a question? If you could come up to one of the microphones or see Alex with the microphone, we'll take a question. Anybody want to start us off?
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. Listening to you and reflecting on what you're saying, it occurred to me that the dysfunctionality and chaos of leadership in the Parliament over the last decade reflects, I think, a struggle that Parliament is having to drag itself out of the 20th century into the 21st century, reflected in its inability to deal with climate policy, the issues around gender and diversity, and a range of other Indigenous rights and so on. And you know, I'm wondering whether that chaos was an essential part of that transition. I'm interested in your thoughts.
I think you've made some very good points. In seeking to explain why there's been such a rapid turnover of Prime Ministers over the course of the past decade, I'd highlight 2 points. One is that I think it's harder to govern in this period. It's a period of political fragmentation when support for the major parties is diminishing. There's more support for minor parties and independents, and it's more difficult for politicians to assemble majority opinion behind particular policies. And of course, it's not just more difficult to govern, but it's more difficult also to implement reforms. And one of the reasons it's more difficult to implement reforms is because on many of the fundamental issues, the nation is divided. Climate change and energy policy is a very good example. There are very strong feelings in the community and in the Parliament about climate change and energy policy, but there is no doubt there is a division, and that division is yet to be resolved. It's been a very debilitating period of time over climate change and energy policy in the past 12 months. Taxation policy, industrial relations policy are other examples where there have been substantial division. The second factor that I would point to in explaining a lot of the instability and dysfunction in the system is that we live in a different age. Technology, social media is transforming the way politics works, but it's also transforming the political culture. Everybody's more impatient. It's a more impatient culture. People expect more from their politicians. They want answers, they want outcomes, they want decisions, and they're less prepared to cut slack to the politicians. If you think back to the 1950s, you saw the Labor Party was prepared to stay in opposition for a number of elections under Doc Evatt and then Arthur Calwell, facing defeat after defeat after defeat. That would be inconceivable today. Politicians are under pressure to respond, and so therefore they react to that pressure. They react to the pressure of social media and the more impatient age. And the more impatient age means that people don't just sit pat. If things aren't working, they are compelled to do something about it. And often that means changing the leader.
Excuse me for not standing up. I've got a sleeping child. Leading on from that point there, I was just interested on your opinion with respect to whether there's any cause for extending the terms of governance. In terms of, I find that 3 years or 4 years, there's very little time to actually make long-term decisions for the betterment of the country at federal and Commonwealth level. And I'm interested to understand Parliament's position as to whether there'll be a movement of some time to be able to put to the people to extend the terms for parliamentarians.
Oh, that's a very good question, and this is a perennial debate. I've been covering politics for many decades, and I can assure you that this debate goes through various cycles. It always reoccurs. It's a 3-year term for the House of Representatives, which in global terms is a short period of time. A number of people argue that it should be extended to 4 years. Occasionally people suggest a 5-year term. I used to, many decades ago, think this was a worthwhile reform, but I've now changed my mind about this for 2 reasons. I think that a good government will be a good government regardless of whether it's living through a 3 or 4 year term. I don't think a 4-year term can make a bad government a good government. The Hawke period was a period of very competent government, and they were 3-year terms. And much of the Howard period was a period of competent government, and they were 3-year terms. And some other governments have not been terribly competent governments, and I think if they governed for 4 years, not 3, then the country would have been worse off, not better off. If you've got a bad government, the fact that it's got a longer term is going to be a negative. So I've come to that conclusion over a period of time. My other reservation about extending the term of the House of Representatives to 4 years really relates to the operation of the Constitution. And essentially the way the Constitution works, a Senate term tends to be twice the term of the House of Representatives. And the idea of having an 8-year term for the Senate would, I think, be undemocratic and completely unacceptable. So you've got a major problem attempting to extend the term of the House of Representatives, and that is, what do you do with the Senate and what does that mean for the Senate? And I do think that's a major institutional obstacle.
I understand that Matt Leach has got a book coming out called Democracy in a Divided Australia, which has an interesting way to look at politics as rather than a left-right divide, it's an inners versus outers divide. And I suppose we're seeing some evidence of that with Brexit, the US elections, and perhaps the rise of One Nation and the minors in the Senate. Have you got any thoughts on the utility of that view?
Well, again, I think this is an excellent question. The question goes to the extent to which the political system is losing touch with the public. And this is a structural challenge and it's a cultural challenge. And clearly the great examples of this tend to be in America and the United Kingdom in recent years, when we see the election of Donald Trump essentially drawing upon, to a certain extent, an outsider culture. People in the United States who felt left behind by the political system, left behind by the operation of the United States system of government, and that sense of alienation of the outsider was very, very important in Trump's election, and he was explicit the way he played to that. And then again, when it came to the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, most of the established sense of politics, the majority in the Tory party, the majority in the Labor Party, the sense of a destiny in Whitehall, the view of the established and elite power centres in Britain was overwhelmingly that Britain should stay in Europe, and yet the vote went the other way. And again, that was a reflection of this sentiment. This sentiment is in Australia. It's not in this country to anything like, I believe, the depth that we've seen in Britain and America. There would be a number of reasons for that. One is that we have compulsory voting in Australia, and compulsory voting keeps everybody inside the tent. This is really important because what it means is the government of the day has got to respond to the entire community, not just the 50 or 60 or 70% of the community that vote. So I think compulsory voting is an important mechanism to play down the gulf between insiders and outsiders. I think the other element here is that we are a more inclusive community in terms of economic outcomes. There's no doubt that while we have a wage compression problem in Australia today, wages over the last 25 to 30 years in Australia have moved at a much stronger rate and increased at a much higher percentage than in the United States, where so many people have been left behind for the past generation and a half. So there is a very different economic outcome. Having said that, though, it is a problem, and it's a problem for the major parties. The major parties are losing votes. The major parties are seeing some of their voters moving away to vote for independents and minor parties. This is a problem the Labor Party faces, it's a problem the Coalition faces, and it's a problem which they need to address.
No? Which one?
Thanks, Paul. I've just got a quick question about leadership in general and saying how difficult it's been over the last decade to maintain strong leadership from either party. In our fast cycle of social media and instant gratification that everyone requires at some level, is true leadership going to be able to happen again in the near future?
I'm tempted to ask you what you think. Well, that is a very difficult question to answer because it goes to one of the fundamental issues of our politics today, and that is whether the dysfunction we've seen in the last decade is just cyclical and we will move beyond this cycle back to a period of stability, or whether it's more structural and cultural, whether it's more deep-seated, which would lead to a more pessimistic conclusion. I think it's a combination of both. I think that we will see a return of sorts to better quality leadership and more stable leadership. It's difficult because the public want a strong leader, but if a leader's strong, the leader runs the risk of dividing the community because the community has different views about what strength means. Strength on behalf of what sort of policy. So often a strong leader can be seen as a divisive leader. I do think that one of the things we need is a touch of Bob Hawke consensus. The magic of Hawke is that Hawke was seen as a strong leader, and yet he was a leader who brought the country together. Now, this combination of strength and consensus, or bringing the country together, this is the magic formula. This is the absolute magic formula for effective leadership. And I think that our politicians need to reflect more on that and work more towards achieving that particular outcome.
Actually, I was going to ask you that question about Hawke and Howard, what you would actually take from those two periods where they've had the long leadership, what the leader today would actually do to move into this new period that we've got, which is transitioning into the 21st century. A lot of us have to transition into the 21st century, but what qualities of those leaderships do you think are relevant for the 21st century?
I think the main qualities are a capacity to understand the Australian public. Hawke and Howard were both very deeply seated in this country, and they liked talking to people. They weren't aloof. They weren't aloof in their entire lifetime. While they were very different sorts of people, they liked talking to the Australian public, they liked talking to the Australian community, and they had a good feel for the Australian public. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they were successful with their own parties, and that's fundamental because we have a party system. So the leader has got to come from deep within the leader's party and have an understanding of the party, its nature and its culture, and be able to win and hold the support of their own party. That is really critical. The third element is judgment. What counts in politics is not IQ. What counts in politics is not sheer intelligence. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You don't have to be an Oxford graduate. You don't have to be a Harvard graduate. But you've got to have judgment. And judgment is a more elusive quality. Judgment is sorting out how far you go on policy reform and where you stop, and how far you push the tolerance of the Australian people and where you stop. The successful Prime Minister has got to succeed in policy and he's got to succeed in politics. He's got to have a blend of both. He's got to know when to go hard and when to retreat and offer appeasement and concessions. And judgment is really important in terms of that. So they're the three qualities I'd highlight: understanding of the public, command of party, and judgment.
Probably got time for one more question, if there's any more.
Did Tony Abbott lack political acumen or judgment, in your opinion?
Well, I think if you asked Tony Abbott, he might concede that the fact that he was deposed by his own party room 2 years after being elected Prime Minister with a very substantial majority suggested a degree of political failure and oversight. That record would suggest a problem. And I think you'd have to look at it from both sides of the equation. You'd have to look at it from the point of view of the party. Did the party do the right thing deposing Tony Abbott in 2015? Now, if you ask members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party this question today, there's not agreement on this. There's a lot of divided views about that. Malcolm Turnbull came in and Malcolm Turnbull won the election with a majority of 1. He won, but a majority of 1 became a pretty significant difficulty for the Turnbull government over the last couple of years. Then you look at it from the other point of view: should Tony Abbott have, as Prime Minister, perform better? And I think Tony Abbott would probably agree that there were certain things he could have done which would have led to a better performance on his part.
Well, I wonder if you can join with me in thanking Paul. It's been, tremendous to share his wisdom and just that perspective that, as the speaker mentioned, a commentator over the whole of the 30 years from the transition from the old place to this place. But Paul really goes back further, and a piece in the Australian today about the First World War, Paul. So certainly someone with a real historical...
I wasn't alive then.
No, I didn't. So certainly someone with that historical perspective, which I think has been really tremendous in just giving us a bit of an insight about the way that the House of Representatives in particular has evolved over the last 30 years and where some of the challenges are in the future. But, I think there is a very positive message at the end of Paul's talk, and that is just the strength of our parliamentary institutions. And as a person who's worked for many, many years myself in the House of Representatives, I think the strength of the House of Representatives as an institution does stand us in very good stead, even in times that are quite turbulent, and I'm sure the House will survive for another 100 years very successfully. So thanks very much, Paul, and can you please join me in thanking Paul for his remarks.